Right, hello everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. So I'm here mainly to talk to you about some accidental advances we've made in understanding Roman archaeology in Flintshire over the last 3 years. So just very quickly to introduce you to the region, for any of you who are not maybe familiar with Flintshire. So obviously we're talking about the modern unitary authority. However, it's within which there's a very distinctive Roman landscape. In particular, we're looking at this lowland Deeside landscape, which is set between the Dee estuary, which of course is a major highway accessing Chester, and then to the southwest, you've got the uplands of the North Clwydian Mountains and the Delyn Plateau. So the latter being a fairly significant monumental landscape in later prehistory. So in terms of our understood or historically documented Roman features running through this landscape, we have the North Wales Roman Road connecting Chester to Carnarvon. In particular, this section is Diva Varis, which is the Margary 67A. As you can see, it runs, we've got a potentially split section running across that northern coast boundary alongside Deeside. And within this, we have only a single well-defined Roman settlement. And this is with the exception of any potential continued Romano-British use of hill forts we have in the region. And that happens to be Pentre Oakenholt, so a combination of Oakenholt and Flint that we've already heard mentioned a few times. So this is a site established by the Legion originally as a lead processing and production site for exporting into Chester and during the construction, very much reflecting the significance of lead in Flintshire at the time, very much so its main exporter. In addition to that, we can lay some claim onto Freeth, which we have joint custody with Wrexham. This, again, is another industrial settlement situated in one of these roads connecting Chester to the wilds of Wales. And again, part of this wider landscape of industrial supply networks for the city of Chester. Over the last 3 years, we've confidently been able to add at least 2 fixed settlements onto this map. The first is Greenfield. So notice its position along the North Wales Roman Road. It's at a point where the main road suddenly goes from being a coastal road and then heads straight inland towards St. Asaph. So St. Asaph is where we believe Varis is likely to be. So this is Varis, which is mentioned in the Antonine Itinerary. And on top of that, even more recently, and by recently I mean we finished excavating just before Christmas, so this is very much, it's not even hot off the press, it's not even seen the press yet. Mancot, near Harden. Very, very close to Chester and within an area of notable absence in terms of Roman archaeology previously. In fact, within 1 kilometre of this site, there is only a single Roman coin and the assumed projection of a Roman road. Within a further 2 kilometres, there's only 2 additional assets within both the National Monument Record and the HER. So this is very much part of that, what we've come to refer to as the Chester hinterland. So first, we'll start with Greenfield. So this is a very long-term project we've been undertaking on behalf of the Greenfield Valley Heritage Park and Flintshire County Council. I'm going to be really rushing through what is 3 years of excavations at this site. So if you want to find out more details, we do have a dedicated page on our website to Greenfield, as well as other previous presentations that have been put onto our YouTube channel on Heneb. So what I meant by accidental advances into Roman archaeology are the original objectives of this site were testing the wider environs of Basingwork Abbey, a Cistercian monastic complex, this version of which established in 1157. So Roman at this point was not really very high in the forefront of our mind. So we're investigating particularly the scheduled area with non-invasive methods and then also looking within the Heritage Park to the south and the gardens of Basingwork House to the west. And This was followed by targeted trenching of our geophysical results, the outcome of which initially, unexpectedly, we did find indeed medieval archaeology, but much to our surprise, none of this was stratified. It was all residual activity, very much associated with post-dissolution recycling of the monastery over a long period of time. So all of it very much fragmentary. I had to include, because I would have been remiss not to, another little residual artefact that came out of these excavations. This is a 10th century Hiberno-Norse baldric strap. So particularly exciting, especially as we know that basing work does have associations in the early, certainly the early medieval period, with it being the northern terminus of Watts Dyke. And you can probably see where I'm going with this. By far, what outnumbered was the Roman assemblage. But not only did we have considerably more Roman artefacts than we had medieval, the Roman artefacts were stratified, most importantly. They were associated with features and deposits. Partly this included a possible defensive ditch to the west of the abbey, but also, more interestingly, structural activity and possible industrial activity within our very small evaluation trench to the south of the abbey. So, of course, at this point, we needed to really rethink our objectives in terms of investigating this site. So we returned in 2024 for a larger targeted investigation to the south of the abbey within the Heritage Park. I should at this point state that we were not the first to identify Roman material on this site. So Thomas Pennant in the 1700s recorded the discovery of a hypocaust to the northwest of the abbey. The Ministry of Works, while they were, I think I can appropriately say, gutting the abbey, they also recorded the discovery of ceramics, as well as prior to that there'd also been some late Roman coinage. More recently, during extensions to the visitor centre of the Heritage Park, local archaeological firm also identified small isolated features within, partially exposed within very small trial trenches, which also produced Roman ceramics. So we refocused to the south, and I'm not going to include a summary of that 2024, so if you would like to see that, please do go and look it up. There is one feature that I will quickly talk about, mainly because we then don't really look at it any further forward in later excavations, but I think it's particularly important. So if you remember that flue that we identified in the evaluation, well, that turned out to be part of a larger oven, the product of which was actually mussel shell. So not for meat, it was for lime ash. This feature in particular, it was also, it's fairly low stratified, so it was cut by later Romano-British activity. So lime ash has multiple applications. You can use it obviously in the construction industry, in lime mortar, you can use it for fertilizer, but also given the context that we find ourselves in Flintshire, it's also used in a process called capillation, which it's used to extract silver from lead ore. Now, what's more interesting about this feature is the two radiocarbon dates that we obtained from it, both of them Middle Iron Age. So quite significant for our Iron Age researchers and metallurgists who hopefully have got a lot to chew on with that fact over the next few years, especially as it points towards hopeful extraction or sort of utilisation of both lead and silver within North East Wales. So fast forwarding to our 2025 excavation, we enlarged our trench to the south. And just first to address, we got what we asked for, but by this point it was rather a disappointment in the sense that we got our medieval feature, but it happened to be a very, very large ditch that had destroyed the majority of our Romano-British archaeology. So it's a ditch that's at least 8 metres wide, and it seems to form part of what seems to be the growing impression of an enclosure surrounding the abbey. And on top of that, we've got many, many, many lovely post holes, some of them very well made, stone packed. I've chosen this one in particular because you can see that lovely flash of orange in the bottom. It's a very nice big piece of unabraded Samian ware, which is lodged up against the lower part of the cut. Perfect thing to find in a post hole. What we can say certainly about these post holes, though, is we're definitely looking at more than one phase of structure. So certainly they certainly don't belong to one. Our issue, however, in the geological conditions that we have, is we lack gullies. We have one gully downslope, which we can link to a single structure. The rest of it, we don't have gullies. And I think we can reasonably explain why we don't, because despite the torrential downpours we had during some of these excavations, the rainwater never stood. It's very free draining. There simply isn't need for surface drainage. So obviously that is something, particularly when it comes to roundhouses, we very much rely on these drip gullies to be able to define the extents of our structures. So we were lucky in this instance to have this beauty right in the middle. It is a very large hearth, certainly not what we would associate with a smaller domestic roundhouse. It's about just under 2 meters long by just under a meter wide, stone lined with flat top pot stones and clay packed in the centre. Just fortuitously, shortly after this excavation concluded, I went on my holidays to Scotland and I stumbled across the Crannog Centre where they have this fantastic reconstruction of a cookhouse hearth. I should say that this isn't something that's specific to Scotland. We also have something very similar in Castell Henllys down in southwest Wales. So the implications of this was quite interestingly replicated in our material assemblage surrounding this hearth, in that very much all the pottery, it reflected consumption, food consumption. And the further implication of this is, so it's a communal building, it's a cookhouse, so it's not a singular domestic structure, and meaning that one thing that we're obviously, with the scale of our excavations and knowing how much of this site we've possibly lost, we can reasonably at least say we're not just looking at a singular small-scale settlement, we are at least looking at a community with need for some form of central communal space. Now, in addition, this is Steve's work of labour. It's so our investigations near the visitor centre, we uncovered the remains of a Roman road. I think we can now confidently say it's not just a Roman road, it's the Roman road. So interestingly, we've got this lovely V-cut ditch, and you can see the remains of a hardcore. We did also extend slightly to the north of this in order to be able to get the width and the northern cut edge. Interestingly, this road the ditch has been recut in the medieval period, and the road has been repaired in the medieval period. So it's been utilised by the abbey. But one of the reasons I think we can argue that it is Diva Varus, you can see that it's running through the abbey here. The present projections of Diva Varus are based on a combination of the fixed points that we have on either side of recorded segments. This segment that we can see that's running around Basingstoke Abbey is largely derived from the Turnpike Road, which of course the Cistercians would not have wanted the main thoroughfare of traffic running straight through their inner precinct. So while they've reutilised the road that was already there, which is taking the path of least resistance over the promontory into Greenfield, they have, of course, later rediverted the traffic. So in terms of material culture, as a commercial archaeologist working in North Wales and the North West is something we're not accustomed to, and the word almost has a bit of a mythical aura around it. We were particularly surprised by this site, and it has recently only just been getting better, really. And it's given us a very valuable opportunity to look at those early relationships between certainly the Iron Age peoples and the arriving Romans. In particular, you can see our lovely late Iron Age Triskel mount in the top corner. So this is quite possibly something that is being made locally, and although we refer to it as late Iron Age, it's probably something that's being made towards the end of the 1st century. And this was found, even better, stratified within one of our roundhouses. And that is accompanied by a large assemblage of, again, quite possibly locally produced brooches. We've got hairpins, we've also got this very nice lion head casket fitting in the bottom corner, as well as some slightly ambiguous artifacts, including this possible nail cleaner, gilded nail cleaner. Unfortunately, this was incorporated within that large medieval ditch cut, so is unfortunately residual, and it actually has a gilded spoon to go with it. The Romanists who've looked at it so far think that it's a crude reproduction of a Roman nail cleaner. However, the Anglo-Saxon specialists have looked at it and said, oh no, that hole punch pattern, that's definitely early medieval. So unfortunately, we're at a bit of a standpoint at that, and I'm not sure we're going to resolve it anytime soon. In terms of the ceramic assemblage, though, you can see I've put an example up here of this nice Holt oxidized ware. It's a globular wine vessel. And this was found in association with our cookhouse within the ditch. It's actually, this is two fragments of two separate vessels. However, you've got the neck, which was actually found on the other side of the site, and then the very large part of the body, which was found associated with the cookhouse. So then we move on to Mancot. And I must reiterate again, we're in the very, very early stages of understanding this site, having only just downed tools. But this has been a particularly exciting discovery purely in the sense that it has no comparison locally. It is in that area of complete absence. So once again, however, we came to this site without having Romans in our mind at all. In fact, our main concern was falling down mine shafts. You can see what has been highlighted in blue here. These are a combination of 17th and 18th century early coal mines, so bell pits. And so as a result, the majority of archaeological monitoring for this site was undertaken under very careful watching briefs alongside coal mining remediation specialists. That left the western part of the site, which we can see in our geophysical survey. We've got some faint lines of possible field boundaries. We can definitely see regular striations of cultivation, but in particular, there's this area of noise, which you can see marked as Pit 13. Based on information that was being produced by geotechnical specialists alongside us, they were suggesting that there's potentially more mining activity in that area as well. So very tentatively, we excavated 2 excavation trenches with the expectation of not getting in them because we were going to fall down a hole. So we anticipated 1 to 2 days of work. However, that very quickly evolved into a 12-week open area excavation after we stumbled across a Roman midden. So this evolved into this fantastic excavation area, which I must say, the overhead photo you can see here was a very rare occasion that we were able to get a snippet of this site where it wasn't underwater. We've really struggled this winter. It's been a really horrible season to be a commercial archaeologist. As you can see, you can see where a lot of our test holes are at this point because they are, by that stage, full of water. So, in terms of the features that we've got here, so you can see that really large black area in the middle. That's the midden that we first struck. So, we've got this large central ditch. This was presented in the geophysics, partly because it is our deepest feature on site, so therefore it's the best preserved. This quite possibly has late Iron Age origins, so the lower fills of which were anaerobic. So it's one of the only places that we've got preserved bone. The site is incredibly acidic, so the only other bone that we've got elsewhere has been either calcined or teeth. But also we've got a single fragment of hand-formed pottery at the bottom, which we've tentatively marked as possibly Iron Age at present, but I'm very cautious about ever applying Iron Age dates to pottery in North Wales, as we so very rarely see it. On top of that, of course, you've got these rectilinear enclosures or plot boundaries that seem to be surrounding this main central ditch. At some point, I think these probably have been active at the same time, and I suspect their main function is drainage. It's a very heavy, well, we're split between heavy clay and sand around the northern extent of the site, which I have no doubt that in the Roman period, drainage would have been as equal a problem as we faced. In terms of structures, just before I missed, there's that midden. So what we originally interpreted as just a midden, but it seems to also form part of a large ditch that then funnels potentially all that water towards the north. We've described it as a midden purely because the quantity of domestic debris that we found within it. Now, in terms of the structures, firstly, our sort of tentative phasing at present is we're looking at these ring gullies. So the larger one that you can see, interestingly, that was reflected in the magnetometry, but not strong enough for us to really have flagged it at that point. Now, this one is distinctively different to all of the others we've got. You can tell in the fills that it was older. So the fills of the gullies, they were grey, compared to the fills of the gullies of all of our Romano-British features, which were very much a black charcoal. But also they were sterile, so there was no pottery within them at all. So we're probably looking at a late Iron Age feature. And then we've got these other ring gullies, one possibly incorporated within a later structure, and then one further down to the south, which looks like it's more likely to be late 1st to early 2nd century. The most prominent, however, are these two apsidal buildings. Someone's taking the same technology or engineering know-how of making a roundhouse and trying to emulate the rectangular structure and just effectively elongating it. But as you'll see, that's not without precedent. I'll go into a bit more details with them shortly as well. But in addition to that, we've also got some less well-defined, partly because they're so heavily truncated. At this point, I should also note, as I forgot to previously, we're lucky to see what we have got because of the very heavy extent of cultivation damage. You can just about see in that orthographic a regular light grey pattern that runs through the site. We had 3-metre wide furrows, followed by a 3-metre wide ridge, 3-metre wide furrow. So effectively, we've lost 50% of the site through that early post-medieval cultivation. I've digressed a little bit there. Back to those structures. One particular is interesting is these areas I've highlighted in rectangular at the top. So these were alignments of very nice stone-packed post holes that seem to be very, very different in character to what we've got in the rest of the site. So what's interesting is obviously they do seem to correlate with those rectangular boundaries that we've got surrounding it. And they do seem very similar to other instances. We've got places like Plas Coch and Wrexham, where we've got these rectilinear boundaries and then very difficult to interpret post holes set within. There's very little in terms of domestic debris associated with them. So at the moment, one possibility is we're looking at maybe ancillary structures linked to the settlement or potentially later occupation. So back to those two apsidal buildings, relatively clear, clearly visible, but also with a very interesting separation of use. Both buildings, their southern extents, you can see are relatively clear, very little in terms of burning, and we can see the outlines of the gullies and we can clearly see the post holes. Whereas both on the northern sides is absolutely packed with burnt clay. It's also where in the smaller one we find the remains of a hearth. But interestingly, amongst all this material, there is the combination of domestic debris, so like I say, teeth, unfortunately the only thing surviving in terms of animal bone, but also pottery, but alongside that, debris associated with metalworking. So quickly onto our parallel. So fantastic examples really has been work by Rob Philpott, and this is where we can see the examples of these other apsidal buildings, which is a phenomenon that we can see within sort of the wider area of Chester. So this in particular is in Merseyside, and these structures being dated to the 2nd and 3rd centuries, if I've got that right. So onto the material culture. We didn't think it could get better from Greenfield, but it did. So once again, a fantastic pottery assemblage. This time, so previously, Greenfield had been very much defined by types that we'd often associated with a military context. So lots of Samian ware, lots of black burnished ware, and lots of amphora. But of course, its location on the coast, it's directly associated with supply links and trade routes, and especially sea-bound supply links. On this site, lots more mortarium. So we've got a lot more processing of agricultural material. And there's certainly larger quantities at Mancott, but also greater preservation, larger fragments, mainly owing to that large midden, which is what we were lacking at Greenfield. On top of that, a great metal assemblage, including coinage. Now, we do actually have quite a lot of coins on this site. Unfortunately, only 2 of them are really readable, but nonetheless, they give us a fantastic span of dates for the site. We've got one denarii of Commodus here for the 2nd century, and then we've got Constantine II. So giving us potentially a fairly long span of occupation. Unfortunately, the latter being residual, which is not particularly surprising, given that we're already assuming that a lot of our later occupation may have been destroyed by the plough. But on top of that, we have at least 17 brooches of varying different types. including enamelled Wirral brooches, we've got dolphin brooches, we've got Colchester types, and a lot of these occurring within the midden. And you can see these two examples that have been x-rayed, so they are completely encased in iron sort of concretion, which has had the added bonus with this lower one that you can see that it's preserved the pin. So we've got almost fully intact, lovely little brooch that is on its way to conservation. So why so many brooches? Well, they're making them here. So we can add, hopefully, another second brooch production site on top of Prestatyn for North Wales. How can we prove that? Well, firstly, we've got these. These are lead brooches. And so obviously lead, not a good material for making a brooch, but also they are lacking the fixture and fitting for a spring and pin. That is because they are formers for making a temporary or single-use clay mould, which also to some extent explains why we don't have any definitive moulds on site. However, we do have a large assemblage of what we've called daub with wattle impressions. I'm going to be reviewing them shortly, just to check if we've got any brooch impressions. On top of that, we've also got paraphernalia associated with metalworking. So we've got a small bronze ingot there, which is that small rectangular one you can see with classic sort of chamfered edges to it. We've got blankers, that sort of bronze bar that's come out the bottom of the midden. We've also got this thin strip one that you can see here. This appears to have been hammered with using a small ball hammer, hammered nice and flat. At the moment, we've flitted between this potentially being a bracelet, given the tapered edges, or whether it's possibly the beginnings of materials used for making Colchester-type brooches, which of course are not cast and rather made from strip metal. On top of that, we've got other yet to be fully understood possible tools and, of course, sharpening stones, amongst a very large assemblage of lead objects and lead working waste, including rolls of lead, which looks like it's effectively recycling material ready for use in production. So, in terms of how this is all hopefully going to fit into a bigger picture, both sites are giving us a fantastic inroad into looking at those early interactions between the late Iron Age peoples and the early arrival of the Romans. Obviously, Caroline's already reflected this in her talk, that we've traditionally always had a very militarised look at North Wales. And I'd argue that a lot of that is a product of the archaeological preservation bias and the fact that it's really military sites that tend to survive best. But and as a result of that, a lot of these sites, particularly Pentre Oakenholt, but also Holt down in Wrexham, there's always been this long concentration of trying to think of, well, how were these sites defended? Well, maybe they weren't. And examples of greenfield, you've got this very early interactions of metalworking and potentially, mutually beneficial. And one of the very important things we need to try and work out there is really trying to fully understand what was the extent of metalworking in the later Iron Age and how that has possibly influenced the interactions with those Romans arriving, and have they chosen to take advantage of the knowledge of the locals rather than just railroad over the local communities. And then, of course, we're getting a better idea of those wider Chester supply networks. We can start to really put aside this whole notion of hinterland. But it does give us the issue of, well, how are we going to identify more sites? Because clearly preservation is a significant issue. And I do worry that obviously we've also already lost a significant amount of sites to development where they simply weren't recognisable within an archaeological condition. And then possibly the even greater challenge is trying to assess later Roman occupation. And I think certainly from Mancot, but also Greenfield, we're already looking at the earlier sites having been heavily impacted by the plough in the medieval period. Therefore, there's a high probability that what would have been our later occupation has long since gone. So therefore, we're heavily reliant on our material assemblage to try and reconstruct that, which, of course, as I've said, material culture, not something we've overly been able to rely on in North Wales in the past. So this is where I think actually a very close relationship with the Portable Antiquities scheme is going to be extremely valuable. So that's more or less it. Thank you very much. If you want to keep tabs of what we're doing, please do follow Heneb. So this is the obligatory requirement that I have to, state at the end of each lecture. But also, do take advantage of the resources that we have to offer, including Archwilio, which is the National Historic Environment Record Digital Archive for Wales, which is, it's a very, very useful research resource. Thank you very much, and yeah, if there's any questions.
That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you for sharing the hot out the ground discoveries. And it's so important to look at that long period of the changes from the Iron Age to the late Roman. So thank you very much. We do have time for some questions. If anybody. Yes. Is it?
Being a person who's thought various times, so how do you interpret Will-style roaches? Are they a marker of local identity of some sort? I think what you said about both Will-style roaches and other styles being made at Bangkok really complicates that sort of simplistic interpretation. You begin to wonder whether after all, it was a matter of just personal taste and fashion.
It's just to repeat the question, it was about Wirral brooches, an interpretation about identity, and any thoughts about what they were meant to represent.
I'll be honest with you, Peter, I would be very foolish to attempt to answer that question given that Evan Chapman is following me in the next presentation. He will be our specialist looking at these brooches, and I think I would strongly recommend reposing that question in about 30 minutes' time.
Yes, Rachel.
Is the work continuing at Greenfield Park? Is there any new or further to calls based on what you've got given up on the medievals? Is it disappointing?
Yeah, again, just to repeat the question, yes, is there going to be more? Are you going to continue?
So we've already had 3 years of work at Greenfield within the Heritage Park, and I think the impact that we've had on their grass has probably lessened the enthusiasm by the park wardens for us to carry on. I think there definitely is scope for us to continue. At the moment, we're mostly working with CADU to try and reevaluate the scheduled area. So we undertook some targeted trial trenching within the Abbey itself to test whether we had the potential for multi-period survival within the Abbey complex as well, which we do. It's just very poor survival. I would like to, but as with all archaeological projects, it's all down to money and if we can try and obtain a suitable funding source. I think we are hoping that we can bring this together. So we've got Greenfields, we've got Mancot, and we've got Oakenholt, that hopefully we can start to now bring together, and we've got a much better sort of research basis for understanding that coastal activity.
Thank you very much again. Thank you.